All right. Well, good afternoon. So I hope all of you are jazzed about revolutionary love. Yes? So I'd like to begin today with a mindfulness exercise. And that's basically how I do most of the workshops that I do. So I'd love for you all to settle into your seats, come to a comfortable seated position, place both your feet on the earth below you, place your hands on your lap or on your knees, and bring your eyes to a close, or place it at your gaze at a stationary point in front of you if closing your eyes is uncomfortable. And take a deep breath and exhale. Breathe in. Exhale. One more time. Breathe in. Exhale. Now bring to your mind an image of what a world without racial bias would look like. A world without racial bias. A world without racism. What would that look like? Breathing in, breathing out. What would a world without racial bias feel like? How does that feel in your body? What does a world without racial bias feel like? Maybe notice the colors, the textures, the images in the body, in the mind, in the breath. And after your next exhale, bring your chin to your chest, stretching the back of your neck, and coming back into the sanctuary by opening your eyes. Now, I'd love for you, when you all have pens and papers, just to jot down on your cell phones a few things that might have come up for you. And this is crucial for me because what you saw and what you felt are your visions. And visions are crucial because they direct our mental, physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual energy. Imagine the visions Jesus had. Imagine the visions Muhammad had. Imagine the visions Buddha had. These were the visions. And imagination is so important because it is the first step to manifesting reality. Facebook, someone imagined that. Cell phones, someone imagined that. Landing a man on the moon, someone imagined that. And now all of you, all of us are tasked with the goal of imagining revolutionary love. Because we need you to imagine it so we can manifest it in our world. So for my talk, I'm going to slightly adjust our mandate, I hope that's okay, Jackie, from why revolutionary love to how revolutionary love. I believe that revolutionary love will be the new world order. I believe that revolutionary love will be the new world order. And I believe that because love is the epitome of humanity's journey on the path of transformation. Order, disorder, reorder. Order, disorder, reorder. Order, disorder, reorder. The journey of transformation. Let me explain with a story. So I immigrated to America when I was 10 years old. So we think of immigration as those poor, helpless people fleeing persecution and oppression to seek opportunity here in the West. While that's true for so many people, Syrian refugees today, refugees from the Holocaust, from Vietnam, that wasn't my case. I wasn't brought here by my consent. I was 10 years old. And before that, in India, I had a sense of order. I had dozens of aunties and uncles that would just come to our house. We lived in a joint family daily, moving around. I celebrated all sorts of festivals on the streets of Delhi with my neighbors, lighting candles on Diwali, playing Holi and throwing color everywhere. all of this made sense. I had a sense of order to my life. There was a sense of community, a sense of belonging. And then began the process of disorder. I was plucked away from this existence by my parents, I was 10, and placed into a school in New York. I didn't speak English, certainly had never left India, and most certainly I knew nothing about American middle school culture. So within days, I became an object of ridicule. I apparently worshipped cows. I was dirty. I was stupid. I was ugly. And all of these definitions were predetermined and prepackaged before I even said a word. So I, as a young person, did everything in my bone to create order out of this situation. I resolved to assimilate, to become American. That is to become white as soon as possible. Within a year, I changed my accent, the way I dressed, the way I would approach people. I didn't speak any Indian languages in public. I even went by the name Andy. Deep inside, though, all I sought was belonging, to feel worthy of love and respect, to belong. And I thought maybe, just maybe, if I excelled academically, people would respect me. So I excelled. I was the valedictorian of my high school, graduated the top 1% of my college class. But regardless of where I went, my doctor's office to the New York City subway, I would hear, "Oh, look, bin Laden is here. Why do you worship cows anyway? Why do you speak this way? Why do you dress that way? Where are you really from?" Constantly under scrutiny, constantly judged. More disorder. And the accumulation of these experiences made me feel like an imposter, disconnected from my peers and the country that I now called my own. And I began feeling less than, less deserving, less smart, less attractive, less human. By the time I was in law school, I internalized all this stuff. I felt dissociated and disembodied from my body. I woke up with no energy. I didn't want to do things that I used to love. And my life got very dark. So 8 years ago, I found myself on the edge of my 18th floor window, jumping off, contemplating jumping off. This is the pinnacle of disorder. As I stood there, a strange insight came to me. The stereotypical projections I felt as a person with brown skin, as an immigrant, as a non-European person, are just stories. They're just stories. They're not true. And I realized that what's kept me so depressed and emotionally wounded all these years since I immigrated here was that people are not seeing me, Anu. People are seeing ideas of me. But forget other people. Going back to Valerie's point, I am not seeing me. I am seeing ideas of me. What I didn't share with you earlier is that for years, when I looked in the mirror, I saw a white man. I'd stand in front of a mirror at certain angles that would make my skin look whiter, my eyes lighter. I wasn't seeing me. I was seeing ideas of me. But I don't want to live in a world where we live in ideas of one another. I want to live in a world where we live in the presence of one another, the real people. And that's the beginning of reorder. Breathe. 1, 2, 3. I get off the ledge. A new order emerged. I was birthed anew. And since then, I found a life that's aligned with my new sense of self, one that is about celebration of my being, to truly unleashing my own potential, but also one that is about belonging in this body, especially in a time where our bodies are under attack. Outside the story of race, outside of all ideas of right and wrong, but just here, in this body. Order, disorder, reorder. Now, I am not alone on this path of transformation. Every single one of you in this room has experienced this: birth of a child or death of a loved one. Order, disorder, reorder. Finding a new love, to divorcing the one you had imagined your life with. Order, disorder, reorder. This is the law of nature, the journey of transformation. So similar to my story, and each one of your stories is the story of our humanity. 500 years ago, every single one of our ancestors was part of a culture, a place that operated in its own way. Whether it was the Aztecs in Mexico, to the Tudors in England, the Solomonic dynasty in Ethiopia, to the Ming in China. Regardless how just or unjust these places were, there was a sense of order. Then, with 1492, began the disorder. With the scientific revolution and the age of exploration on the one hand, and conquest, pillage, enslavement, and extinction of various species on the other. Not only here in America, but across the world. Our nation, the United States of America, was born in the era of disorder. And through this era of disorder emerged a new order, the global paradigm of different human races. In this paradigm, a new story was created, the story of race. This story was anointed as a scientific truth less than 200 years ago by a bunch of guys who loved to collect skulls and body parts of people from across the world. Central to this story was the invention of the category Caucasian. It was based on a skull of a formerly enslaved woman from the country of Georgia. Because it was from the Caucasus, all people with that skin pigmentation were called Caucasian. But simultaneous to that, a story of race was created with 5 simplistic categories: Mongoloid, Africanoid, Americanoid, Caucasoid, and Malayanoid, all these oids to make it sound scientific. But it's pure fiction of mind. But what they did was, all the positive attributes of humanity were prescribed to Europeans. And everyone else, black bodies, brown bodies, Muslim bodies, indigenous bodies, were measured based on their innate pathology. Criminals, lazy, uncivilized, savage. This was the reorder. Never in human history before this time did we measure the character, the content, the intellect, and competencies of a person based purely on their appearance. That's what race became. And this justified horrific acts of slavery and removal of indigenous peoples across the world, from the US and Canada to Australia, New Zealand, to across the Americas. Asian exclusion laws, the Jim Crow laws, apartheid, the scramble of Africa, and colonization of countries from the Middle East to India to Indonesia. And in this new order of different human races emerged the idea of racial bias. Now, there are 2 kinds of racial biases. One is conscious bias, or racism. That's when you've bought yourself into the story of race. You believe in a color-based human hierarchy, and you actually believe that the stereotypes and the stories that accompanies these artificial fictional categories are real. And second is unconscious bias, which is these are the ingrained habits of thoughts that lead to errors in how we perceive each other and make decisions. And this is what our collective humanity has been infected with from the order of different human races. But as we know, the law of nature is order, disorder, reorder. The good news is each one of you was born in the era of disorder. This is the age of freedom riders, the age of the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the global feminist movement, the gay rights movement, and the independence movements of countries across the world, from Jamaica to Algeria, Mozambique to Singapore. This era of disorder is the era of global capitalism, of globalization, and global supply chains. And like my own personal stories, in this era, all of us have tried very hard to create order of this disorder. We have loved across the color line, we've become allies to many marginalized groups, we've marched for Black lives, we've opposed corporate greed at Occupy Wall Street, and even our institutions have tried to address this through anti-discrimination laws, through diversity protocols and procedures, through affirmative action programs, but to what end? Despite all these laws, we live in a hyper-segregated country. 2/3 of Americans need to move neighborhoods for us to be fully integrated. Judges sentence Black men on average 18 months longer than white men for identical crimes. Doctors are prescribing medication at lower rates to darker-skinned patients, particularly pain medication, than white patients. Teachers are suspending children of color at rates 3 or 4 times higher than white children. And the racial wage gap is the highest it's ever been in 36 years. And of course, we're living in a world where threats of wars and walls, hate crimes and bigotry, violence and terror looms everywhere. I see you, Jackie. But the root cause of this is this fictional story of race. Now, this begs the question, from this period of disorder, can we create a new order? This is the order of revolutionary love. And I believe we can. And this is the work our ancestors started, what Valerie and Jackie laid out. Think about it this way. Our entire life thus far has been a dress rehearsal. Now it's showtime. Think about it this way. From a fairy tale metaphor, the beast of racism and racial bias is out. And as Beyonce would say, we all have to show up to slay. This is it. This is where we are. So how do we do that? For me personally, it's through breaking bias. Bias is merely an algorithm of the mind that can be hacked. And it's a product of our conditioning. So while there's conscious racial biases, which are just belief systems, the vast majority of reasons why there's so much racial disparity in our country is because of unconscious bias. Our brain has been trained to have this algorithm. The second we see a physical manifestation, we have certain associations based on the story of race. So what we have to do is cleanse our brains. We have to cleanse our nervous systems of this bias. And the cool thing is we can do it. Science has advanced way beyond. We have the research, the technology, and the resources to make this happen. What we need is a will, a collective will. And that's what I do full-time, every day at Be More America. We basically train leaders across industries to hack bias, to overcome these biases. And then we just have to keep on repeating them. So how many of you are in this journey for revolutionary love, this new order to break bias? Yes, no, yes, yes. Great. I believe that if we can land a person on the moon, if we can create artificial intelligence, if we can have virtual assistants like Alexa, breaking bias is a thing of the past. And I have a challenge for you. I want us to break bias by 2040. Eradicate bias in our world by 2040. This is what's going to require for the new order of revolutionary love to become a public ethic. Eradicate bias by 2040. How many of you are with me? Eradicate bias by 2040. And it's going to require all of us to let go of judgments, of control, and move away from the tactics of shame, blame, and guilt, which prevent behavior change. And move towards what Pope Francis called compassion, humility, and tenderness. He talks about this new order of revolutionary love as the age of humility and tenderness. And this is what we need to do. I want you to go back to the vision you all had in the beginning. take a breath, and imagine again, what would a world without racial bias look like? What would a world without racial bias feel like? You may not know yet, but you're already breaking bias because you're here. You're committed to revolutionary love. And I believe that in the line of all the ancestors, as Dr. King said, we will create that inclusive, beloved community. But that's going to require a shift in our hearts as well as our lives. And it's up to us to make that happen. It's time for revolutionary love, so let's break bias, let's be more America. Thanks so much.
I want to start off by building on what you just did, sharing with you what I imagine when I imagine a world beyond racial bias. And it's an image that was given to me by Toni Morrison in her essay in the book edited by Wanimi Leviaba called The House That Race Built. And it's essays on American culture. And Toni Morrison, in her inimitable Toni Morrison way, is asked if she can imagine a post-racial world. And she says, I don't want a post-racial world. I want a world in which race ceases to be the site of harm, but becomes the site of freedom. And then she says, I want a world where a woman can awake at midnight as the moonlight comes through her window and casts its light on her eyes. And she walks down her stairs off her porch and she wanders out into the woods. And as she wanders, she hears the cry of a baby at a distance and walks to her neighbor's house and finds her friend sitting on the front porch with her newborn child. And they sit there together and talk for a while, rubbing the child's tummy, giving her a little milk. And then it's time to put the child to bed. And the woman arises from the porch and steps back into the woods. And she has the freedom to decide, shall she go home or shall she wander further? Because she knows that no one anywhere considers her prey. Toni Morrison. Let me begin by just saying a word of thank you to Jackie and Middle Church for doing this, for Valerie. Jackie, Valerie, and I have all three, for now probably 4 years, been talking about revolutionary love and have been generating revolutionary love conversations. Also David Kim, his love-driven politics work. I mean, it's been fermenting and growing. This past year, I was president of the American Academy of Religion, which is a group of about 10,000 nerdy scholars. We're kind of nerdy. Yes, we are. Who get together once a year to share papers about religion. And when you're president, you get to choose the topic. And this past year, I was president and chose the topic revolutionary love for this conference in San Antonio. And it just so happened, I did not know this when I was elected 3 years ago, that I would be asked to give my address on revolutionary love 1 week after the election. And I've never been more afraid in my life than when I stood up to try to say words and speak words into that space that would have any kind of purchase or significance. And yesterday I pulled out that talk and I read it, and I was amazed by the level of despair that was in it. First of all, I realized in writing it that I could not have imagined in November how quickly Trump would begin to enact his fascistic hate-mongering campaign to dismantle the basic infrastructure, frail as it may be, the basic infrastructure of our country and all that millions have died and struggled for. I agree with you, Valerie, nothing short of the future, the existence of democracy is at stake. Let there be no mistake as we move into these conversations about revolutionary love that this man and his administration and many of his congressional leaders and many, but not all, of his supporters want to crush us, to destroy this work, to destroy our bodies and our lives. Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, once reminded us that there are two kinds of wars. There are wars of maneuver, which are wars of conquest in which territories are taken. He says those are the most obvious wars. Those are the wars that you win or lose in a period of time. But he pauses, he says there is a more dangerous kind of war, and he calls it war of position. And these are wars that are fought for the territory of hearts and minds and the character of community. It's the war in which real power is exerted and changed. It is a slower war, but it is a much more dangerous and high-stakes war. These wars of position, in the context of thinking about revolutionary love, sisters and brothers, we need to admit we are in the middle of a war. And in many ways, it's a war that has been raging for a long time. Donald Trump has just actually articulated in a particularly loud way the battle cry of an intransigent white supremacy that has been dug deep in the soil of this country for now almost 500 years. So what does revolutionary love at this moment mean? Again, I'm an academic nerd. I'm not a preacher. So when I talk about love, I want to talk about it first in a sort of parsing way to look at what we mean when we throw this term around. As Valerie said, and as Jackie said as well, it's a term we use often, and sometimes we know what it means, and sometimes it comes out of parts of our bodies, and we don't even know what we're saying when we mention it. It's a word that has a long history around the globe in many cultures. In Western culture, it's a term that first got its purchase through Plato with his notion of love as being the some ascending space beyond our bodies and our time, in which we are at one with all and God. But since that time, the word love has gone through transmutations, particularly during the time of the Enlightenment, in which something very important happened to the term love. During the Enlightenment in the West, the world that people live in together was imagined into two distinct separate spheres. There was the public sphere, which was the sphere of work. It was the sphere of reason. It was the sphere where labor happened and economies were built and money was exchanged and empires grew and houses were constructed and roadways were built. This was the public space of men, of white men. And then there was the world of domestic space. And domestic space was the world of white women. The labor of people of color was going underneath all of this division, not even figured into it. But the world of the domestic sphere was the world of white women, where love resided, where care happened, where children were born and fed, where luxury and pleasure and things like vacations and religion and time out and the economy of friendship was located. It was the sphere of affect. And that was a sphere that was given to women. That was the sphere that was, by virtue of its connection to the activity of unseen care, attributed to communities of color. And with that attribution, it disappeared from public view as the space of political reflection. And that's how we get to a point today where when we bring up the concept of love, we feel like we're bringing something new back into politics, which is only not there because of a political economy that took it out. And that was directly related to the construction of gender and race in the European West. So what does it mean to step out of that binarism and bring love back into the conversation about how we do our political lives? Well, it means we, as all of us are here today, begin to think beyond these binarisms about interconnectedness, about notions of equal value, taking delight in difference. We begin to understand the earth as not simply the space where we stand, but engage the earth as a partner with us in this thing we called life. It is a place where we come to new understandings of how we know, unconscious bias, knowing our minds are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we are consciously aware of, and that whole embodied reality that we walk around with, that we are communicating for, comes to the fore. It is a world in which we begin to imagine what it looks like for all to flourish. We are at a turning point in human history. Winona LaDuke, Native American activist and writer, who spent the last 6 months at Standing Rock, was with us at Union Theological Seminary Wednesday evening for the Judith Moyer's Women of Spirit lecture. She described this moment as one in which we stand as a people globally with two paths before us. One path is scorched. It is a dead path. The trees have no flower. The ground is covered in ashes, and you cannot see a horizon. And the other path is green, and the trees are growing, and there are people there. You can still see mud and smell dirt. She says, we're at the turning point where we have to choose which path we will walk on, because the path that has brought us to this place is the one that continues to lead us in this direction. Now, one of the things that's hardest for me as I think about revolutionary love and the turning around that it will take to get us collectively to walk down this path is that turning, and that walking is not something that we will see happen in our lifetimes. It's not something that's going to happen fast. It's not going to happen because of next week's protest or next month's policy change. Even those are steps along the way. It will happen because we have a revolution of consciousness. A change in the whole way in which we view and understand our world. I had an unusual experience this last 3 weeks at Union, in which for the last 3 weeks, step by step, we had huge conferences in which we were addressing crucial issues. The first one was on the theology of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and we were celebrating the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, in which Dietrich Bonhoeffer nailed up his thesis and began what we think of today as Protestantism, which is the basis of the theology that this church originated from. And as we talked about Bonhoeffer with people coming from all around the world to explore his legacy, we remembered the legacy of Bonhoeffer, who came to Union in the 1920s as a privileged white German man, who had his world changed around when he began to attend Abyssinian Church in Harlem, and had his heart and imagination swept away by the Harlem Renaissance, and returned to Germany even though he could have stayed in the United States. He returned, he walked back into the fire, and became, as a Christian, part of a group of people who met underground to plot the assassination of Hitler. It was uncovered, he was imprisoned, and he was executed 3 days before the end of the war. But at the end of our conference on what Bonhoeffer would be doing and saying and being today, everyone agreed that even the categories that Bonhoeffer himself imagined no longer work. that Protestantism and the categories that it generated to construe the world based on notions of good and evil, of the saved and the unsaved, need to be thrown away because the world itself is pushing at the edges. Notions of heaven, salvation, the centrality of a notion that only through Jesus are you saved. No, it doesn't work anymore. Now that this was the result of a conference devoted to celebrating the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, this is a very good sign. The next week we had a conference, the first one ever in the United States, of Asian and Asian Pacific Islander seminarians and faculty gathering to talk about theological education, about their heritage, and about what it means to move forward. The stories they shared, the imagination that they brought to the conversation about what theological community means and what it means to be a spiritual person, sort of burst open space at Union that hasn't been opened before. And there we saw, even in the sounds and the structure, what it means to move beyond purity categories, what it means to move beyond Western notions of race into cultures where difference has been configured in entirely different ways, and yet where the history of imperialism from the West, but also internal to Asia itself, has been wrestled with for centuries. And at the end of that meeting, the very last conversation was, even amongst the Asian Pacific Islanders, the categories we have used, they do not work. We need to imagine something new because it's not clicking with the reality in which we find ourselves. The students said, we're at Union not because we simply want to dredge up a past heritage. We're struggling to see something new. And then this last week, in fact, part of it's happening today. That's why there's not more Union students in the audience. They would be down here. We're having a conference on sanctuary. We declared ourselves a sanctuary seminary about a month ago, and we're exploring. We're exploring what that means, not just in terms of all of the hard work that goes into putting in place the things that stop any agency from coming on campus, any police agency from coming on campus, looking for undocumented people. It stops us providing any kind of information about the status of our students and provides physical sanctuary to those whose lives are at risk. Expanding beyond that begins to think about what would it mean for our whole world to be a sanctuary world. What does it mean to live in a place where, through revolutionary love, we no longer have churches and hospitals and houses of worship and schools as special sites for sanctuary, but rather the world itself is that sacred space where everyone is safe. Again, the sanctuary movement itself is pushing beyond its own categories of what it means to be sanctuary, to push it into the world so that space opens up for new imagining. So I want to say just a little bit more. I had other things I was going to say, but you covered so much about, we're probably going to repeat all of us, each other. But I want to talk about particularly this conference, Revolutionary Love and Racism. And I want to talk about white supremacy. And I want to talk about white supremacy beyond the categories of when the notion of Caucasian came to be in the anthropologist's mind in Western culture, and talk about what it means in the United States. And here, James Baldwin has been tremendously important to me. James Baldwin talks about, has wonderful, wonderful passages about how whiteness came into existence in America. And he takes the figure of the Swedish farmer who crosses the ocean and comes to this soil not as a white person, but he becomes white through burning indigenous villages and raping Native American women and then building ships that bring from Africa the bodies of Africans who go to work in fields and spill their blood so that he can make money. He becomes white over a 300-year period in which he constructs the most brutal and torture-bound system of extracting labor from bodies and resources from the earth that the world has ever seen. It is through those practices that white supremacy was built. And it was built on the notion that you had to take these white Europeans and you had to contort them into people capable of such brutality. And you don't do that for 300 years to people and not have that legacy live deep in the bones, not only of the infrastructure of our country and of the walls of all of our buildings, but deep in the white psyche of white people. And inherent in that is notions of white supremacy that have the privilege of not recognizing that the very identity of whiteness itself cannot be extricated from the history of that genocide, that slavery, and the power that it continues to wield to enforce those systems of horror and terror. So the work of revolutionary love has to be the work of dismantling that legacy, which means telling the truth about it. And this week with Winona LaDuke at Union, we were privileged together many of the Native American leaders from New England, particularly the tribes of New York and New Jersey. And one of them, Sachin Stormhawk, who is the head of the Algonquin tribe, said to us all, "You know, I have only met one group of people who has not, in fact, been colonized by this same mindset." Sachin Stormhawk said that. And this was a tribe I met in Brazil last week in the Amazon. But he stood up in front of everyone. He said, "We have to all admit we are part of this sickness. There is no privileged space where you have not been touched by it." Now, for that to come from a native person who has suffered 500 years of displacement and the rage underneath that was a very powerful moment. So what does it look like for us to go and cure that disease, to choose that green path? I heard yesterday a wonderful quote. Someone asked Duke Ellington what jazz was going to be like 20 years from now. And Duke Ellington responded, he said, "Well, if I knew that, I'd be doing it now." I mean, part of it is, this makes the point that we don't know what it looks like. And we are in a moment of extreme motion and emotion, but we are also in the midst of birthing and changing and creating that thing that is to come. So a few words to end with about what it will take to move towards that green path. And we need to approach it with humility, recognizing at all times the limits of our knowledge, and that we will always learn things from listening to the voices that are at the margins of whatever reality we inhabit. Secondly, we need to give our children the armor they need to live in empire in order to continue the struggle beyond us. Ruby Sales talks about this in her comments on the civil rights movement and reflects on the failure of her as a civil rights activist and all of her friends and all of her fellow colleagues and comrades to recognize in their own movement what a central role music and spirituality played, so that then they did not take it seriously enough in educating the political education of their own children to pass that legacy on. So our children are all out there in the streets with no armor to protect them.
I'm very grateful for the life and for the ministry of my dear sister, the Reverend Jackie Lewis, and for also her invitation to think with you all today around the subject of revolutionary love. Specifically, around the questions of where are we now, where do we need to be, and what do religious leaders and the faith community, what ought we be doing to help get us there, to help approximate revolutionary love. I am grateful for the work of this church and for the work of my very distinguished colleagues, these freedom fighters here who I'm honored to share in this conversation with. So, some of you may know that I am a theological ethicist by training. But what most people do not know about me is that I am also a horror movie buff. And it's not just scary movies. I love mysteries, thrillers. My spouse absolutely despises it. He's not into it at all. But I am drawn to scary movies and thriller fiction. And I've really been more recently trying to understand why that is the case. Why, I'm a preacher and I'm, a pastor and a teacher. Why do I like to, cuddle up on the couch on Friday nights and watch scary movies rather than, for instance, genre of film like romance or drama or even comedy, all of which, as a movie person, are good with me too. But it's the scary movie that really takes my attention. And I think that we all know that horror films are not typically known for being the finest works of art. They are not the finest works of cinematography. More often than not, in fact, the plot is bad, or at least unsophisticated. The videography, likewise, is nothing to write home about. The acting is generally questionable, to say the least. Horror films, thrillers, mystery, they can be overwhelmingly brutal, and you can always figure out, you can always see the trouble, right? Although you see it coming, it seems that no one else in the film can actually figure out until it's too late, right? And up until recently, all the black people die. And for those of us, how many of you saw Get Out? Right? So up until recently, all the black people died. For those of us who have seen Get Out, I'm sure we can admit it for ourselves that we thought that Chris was a goner when we heard those police sirens at the end of the film as he was kind of choking the life out of white supremacy. But with all of this taken together, I'm still left wondering, why, as a theologian, why, as a lover of the gospel, a lover of sacred text, why I set myself up in my spare time, outside of my daily work of battling intersections of race and gender and class and sexual subordination, why do I set myself up to watch this crap? I'm telling you, I've been thinking about this for a while now, and it finally came to me as I thought about what I would talk with you all today. As I thought about what a revolutionary love conference might have to do with the thriller that I am thinking about watching tonight. What is the strand of continuity? How do these things fit together? And it finally came to me as I was sitting at my dining room table, that in most thrillers, in most horror films, not all, but most, there's always a survivor. There's always somebody who, after having fought with monsters and confronted demons and battled with bad guys and dodged bullets and brutes and terror of all kinds, even if they are scarred and bruised and burned and frightened or limping, there is always a survivor. As a womanist theologian and ethicist, survival is the heartbeat of my work. And when I think about where we are right now, to be quite honest with you, nothing sophisticated emerges. In fact, the immediate responses that come to me when I'm confronted with this question are, in fact, the titles of horror films. When I ask myself the question that guides this first panel of the day, where are we? I think Apocalypse, Psycho, A Nightmare on Elm Street. I think Scream, The Purge, Fright Night, World War Z, Night of the Living Dead, Paranormal Activity. Deliver us from evil. In other words, what we are living through right now, it's so bad, it's so brutal, it's cast with such amateurish, incompetent actors in the lead, with so much obvious trouble all around, where Black and brown people who sit at the intersections of other socially subordinate indicators, poor, women, queer, young, where Black and brown people die first. This makes me feel like I'm in a bad horror film. It makes me feel like I'm being punked, that the camera crew is about to jump out at any moment. But what's even worse than this, what's even worse than thinking about all of this is knowing, and there is a difference between what you think and what you know. It's even worse knowing that for as much as such terror is the property of fantasy, the possession of hashtag Hollywood so white, it's also contiguous with flesh and blood. This monster, which is constituted by the hegemony of white male power, its supremacy, its nationalism, which has been nurtured in the bosom of white women, which has been coddled in the embrace of minoritized communities who hate themselves, in submission to the lie they have been told about themselves by the arbiters of power. This monster, this demon, this brute, this Leviathan, this evil is real. And whether we want to acknowledge it or not, this evil is not a new resident in our nation. As a liberal white gaze that disappears Blackness toward the end of privileging melodic composition would have us believe, Black people have been dying in this nation since 1619. Everybody, Ben Carson, is not an immigrant. And recognition of such is not anti-immigrant, but it's the truth. It's truth of the fact that the city on a hill is not a myth or a legend, but it is a lie. We, Malcolm said, didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. Black people have been crying out for revolution ever since they sang on plantations, "Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land, and tell old Pharaoh to let my people go." Black people have been crying out for revolution, crying out to the colored nations of the world like David Walker, crying out about the Southern horrors and the red record of lynching in the South like Ida B. Wells Barnett, crying out for the right to work like Asa Philip Randolph and Maxine Smith and Adam Clayton Powell Jr., crying out that God is a Negro, which did not start with James Cone, but with Henry McNeil Turner. This revolutionary call is not new. Therefore, to ask the question, how did we get here? How did we get to where the administration of our country, the administration of our local governments, our schools, and our churches is wielded by white terrorists, sometimes white terrorists in black or brown face, who proclaim that the white god of capitalist hyperacquisition is great. To understand how we got here requires us to mine the logics of genocide, slavery, and rapeability, and the ways in which such logics have informed the normative Christian project since the dawn of modernity. Asserting in Christ a bottom line where only certain bodies matter, typically white, typically male, typically land-owning and heterosexual in public. And that the rest of us don't matter. It was propagated biblically in this way: cursed be Canaan, a slave of slaves shall he be to his brethren. This is our nightmare. This is the everyday horror that we face in church, in academy, in society. Now, my work as an ethicist begins where problems start. This means that every day, my work begins with the problem of evil, or what womanist theologian, systematic theologian Joanne Terrell refers to in her classic text, Power in the Blood, as theodical intent. And perhaps this is why horror films make sense to me. Because in their insensibility, I know how really real it is. Yet even given the horror of the reality of our time, which is not new, I'm reminded why the survivor at the end of any decent horror film is so intriguing to me. And that's because a survivor indicates that there is still hope. It indicates that the beast can be stopped, even if momentarily. It indicates that somebody will make it, even if it's not me. So as it relates to the final question about us, I think that what we need to do is to produce, or to embrace rather, a survivalist mentality. One that is not based in utopic vision. Because as has already been indicated by my panelists, I'm not sure any of us know really what liberation and justice actually look like. I mean, if we were to talk about Tillich, we understand these things ontologically, and I'm not sure that being can actually be held in vision. But I will say a survivalist politics, a survivalist ethic that is rooted in a theology of hope that is not Moltmannian as it relates to the hope of the resurrection of the crucified, primarily because even though we may need to bear crosses, we don't need any more people dying on them. Jesus already paid it all. So we can throw Moltmann to the side. We don't need a theology of hope that is oriented to more of us dying, but one that is oriented to more of us surviving. Even if we in our human power can never perfect the love and the justice that we seek. Survival. So that as people of faith, we don't, like I'm going to do tonight, sit back in the comfort of our couch and watch as horror continues to unfold. But that we run toward the monster, knowing that even if we don't win, it might mean that someone else will survive. Thank you.
So it's striking to me that without any real coordination among us ahead of time, there's some real themes running through the presentations. And the running theme is all about transition, right? The end of something old, the beginning of something new, the horror of the chaos of the moment as the one thing is struggling to die and the other thing is struggling to be born. You'll all be happy to know the data supports that. So I'm going to give you some vital signs. Maybe we'll think about it that way, right? I'm going to read from the chart and give you some stats on where the old world is and where the new world is coming to be. And I'm going to actually start with an obituary. And it is an obituary for white Christian America. It comes from the beginning of my book that came out last summer. It literally begins with an obituary for white Christian America. I'm going to read an excerpt from it because I think it's a good place to start. We've had a birth narrative. We're going to have an obituary. All right, here we go. After a long life spanning nearly 240 years, white Christian America, a prominent cultural force in the nation's history, has died. White Christian America first began to exhibit troubling symptoms in the 1960s when white mainline Protestant denominations began to shrink, but showed signs of rallying with the rise of the Christian right in the 1980s. Following the 2004 presidential election, however, it became clear that white Christian America's powers were failing. Although examiners have not been able to pinpoint the exact time of death, the best evidence suggests that white Christian America finally succumbed in the latter part of the first decade of the 21st century. The cause of death was determined to be a combination of environmental and internal factors, complications stemming from major demographic changes in the country, along with religious disaffiliation, as many of its younger members begin to doubt white Christian America's continued relevance, as Serene was pointing out, in a changing cultural environment. Among white Christian America's many notable achievements was its service to the nation as a cultural touchstone during much of its life. It provided a shared aesthetic, a historical framework, and a moral vocabulary. White Christian America's vibrancy was historically one of the most prominent features of American public life. But white Christian America has not been without its critics and controversies. Its reputation was especially marred by its general accommodation to and participation in the institution of slavery up until the Civil War. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, white Christian America's apathy toward, and in many quarters even staunch defense of, segregation in the American South did little to overturn these negative associations. Its credibility was also damaged when it became mired in partisan politics in the closing decades of the 20th century. Late in its life, white Christian America also struggled to adequately address issues such as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender rights, which were of particular importance to its younger members as well as to younger Americans overall. White Christian America is survived by two principal branches of descendants: a mainline Protestant family residing primarily in the Northeast and Upper Midwest, and an evangelical Protestant family living mostly in the South. Plans for a public memorial service have not been announced. All right? So let me walk through, just give you some data. I had some slides. You'll be glad to know that technical difficulties have spared you of those slides. But I will give you sort of a visual narrative of them nonetheless. Because it really is the story and less than the numbers that really make sense here. But one of in 2012, right after Barack Obama's reelection, I got what was probably the most troubling email I've ever received from a white Christian group. I'm on all kinds of mailing lists. And this was right after Barack Obama's reelection. It was between that and Thanksgiving. And this email landed in my inbox, and it had this black and white photo on the top of it of a group of people around a table. They're all white. There's a man at the head of the household. It's basically a Thanksgiving table scene that they're setting up there. Maybe you know the Norman Rockwell Freedom from Want painting. It looked a lot like that. It's a black and white photo. And the little caption said, "Christian Family at Prayer, Pennsylvania, 1942. And then if you went down the line and you kind of kept reading the email, what became kind of striking about it is that this was an email from the Christian Coalition of America, which is a kind of white conservative Protestant group in the country. And when I kept kind of looking at it, I realized, okay, this is really odd. What is this showing, right? This image of this white Christian family at prayer right after our first African-American president has been reelected to office. And it became like suddenly clear, oh, that's America, right? That's a reclaiming of America in the face of the reelection of our first African-American president. And what was striking about it is I kind of kept reading, and looking for the text. It basically said this. We are about to celebrate the 200th anniversary of Thanksgiving, and God has not yet condemned this nation, although we now so richly deserve it. Please join with us in praying for our nation, for God to protect us from those enemies without and within who want to see America destroyed. That was the text right under this photo of the white Christian family at prayer. And it just stayed with me. I couldn't quite shake it. It just seemed so over the top and so apocalyptic. As I begin to kind of take a step back and look at the data, my day job is kind of looking at religious and cultural trends in the country. I began to realize that we had passed this monumental threshold in the country that no one was really talking about. And I think some of the real dysfunction and anxiety and transference and all kinds of odd behavior by white Christians in this country is because they do not understand, or they sort of feel it in their bones, but haven't been able to take it into their mind and their kind of conscious psyche, the end of this world. If we look at the stats, just to give you a few, we actually, during Barack Obama's presidency, crossed from being a majority white Christian nation, demographically speaking, to a minority white Christian nation. So we went from, at the beginning, when Barack Obama was reelected, 54% of the country identified as white, non-Hispanic, and Christian. By the time Barack Obama left office in this last election cycle, that number had dropped from 54% to 43, right? 11 percentage points during Barack Obama's presidency. The other bellwether issue for conservative white Christians especially was the issue of same-sex marriage, right? All in, opposing that issue from day one, well before abortion, well before any other issue, was opposition to gay rights. And what we saw in the numbers on that is that when Barack Obama first got into office, only 39% of the country supported same-sex marriage. Barack Obama himself did not publicly support same-sex marriage in 2008. By the time Barack Obama leaves office and we have this last election cycle, that number jumped to 59% support in the country. We have more recent numbers, even from 2017, it's gone from 59 to 63 just in the last few months. But if you think about that, right, and you're like a conservative white Christian, that is the end of the world, right? And I think that is part of what we are dealing with in our country right now, is this reaction. To kind of make this really clear, if we look at the generational differences in the country and religious identification, and you look at seniors, and you think of maybe that black and white photo from 1942, right, and what counted as America, 2/3 of seniors, Americans age 65 or older, identify as white and Christian. That number among young people today is about 20%. So there is this factor of 3 change just over the generations that are alive today. Right? It's an enormous amount of change that we have upon us. Part of that change has been driven by young white Christians leaving their churches in droves. In fact, if you look at the number of unaffiliated people in the country, we have gone from being only 6%, a country that in the 1990s had only 6% of the country claiming no religious affiliation. That number today is 23%, right? It's increased by a factor of 4. If you look at young people today, it is nearly 40% of young people who claim no religious affiliation. Now, I'm not talking about people who just say they don't go to church or mosque or synagogue. These are people who will not claim a religious label of any kind. When you ask them what is their religion, they say nothing. That is a genuinely new thing in the American scene that we're dealing with. Most of those people were raised in white Christian churches and left. All of that is to say, the one thing that we're seeing here is a sort of cultural world that is sick unto death, and people are reacting to that. The other thing I wanted to say before I kind of give a shift to the question of race is there's nothing in the data, even though what's difficult I think about this election and to kind of keep perspective on this election is that so much has changed, right? Both houses of Congress, the White House, Supreme Court justice. I mean, it is big, and there are a lot of changes. What is so difficult about it, I think, is that so little changed to create this massive event. If you look at the election, if you gave me 78,000 votes, I could present to you President Hillary Clinton. 3 states, 77,744 votes across 3 states were what determined this election. That is 0.05% of the votes that were cast in the election. In Michigan, it came down to 10,000 votes in Michigan. Very, very, very close election. There are only 2 elections in American history where a president lost the popular vote by a bigger margin and still won the presidency. And both of those were in the 19th century. So it is really a very anomalous event. One of the things I think is happening here, and maybe one metaphor, if I continue the kind of death thing to think about, is what we're experiencing is a world that has sensed itself dying and has rushed to throw every kind of life support it can throw at itself to keep itself alive. But we all know what happens, right, in the medical settings when that happens, right? That's the reason why we have advanced medical directives and those sorts of things. Because sooner or later, if we're just throwing every piece of technology we have at death, we end up with the extended heartbeat and breath that is no longer a person. It's funny you mentioned horror movies. I actually mentioned Frankenstein in the book. And the reason I used it is, and probably I'm not a theologian. I work with numbers most of the time, but I would say maybe the most theological line in the book is where I'm talking about this sense of white Christian churches like they're on life support, right? But it's an artificial extension of something that has died. And I said there that it's like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, right? And it is this human attempt at resurrecting something that has died. And the thing that we know is that resurrection by anything other than divine power always produces a monstrosity. And I think that is part of what we're seeing in our politics and in our society today. This topic was like, where are we? Kind of big picture stuff. I'm going to say a little bit about race here. This morning, actually, I was catching up on some news. So I'm a graduate of Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. It's the largest Southern Baptist seminary in the country. It's the largest seminary, bar none, actually, in the country in terms of numbers of students. Just this week, there was a story that I think is like, in some ways, like a real sense of like, where are we in terms of particularly the white evangelical world on race. Some of you may have seen it. It was kind of under the radar, so probably not, but I'll describe another photo to you. The entire senior faculty of the School of Preaching at Southwestern Seminary decided it would be a good idea, they're all white and middle-aged, to dress up like African-American rappers. And to take a photo and to put it on Twitter and wrote Notorious SOP, School of Preaching, and a backdrop behind them in graffiti style writing. And we're posing, making, pseudo gang signs, and one of them has a handgun across his chest in the photo. And under it, it was like, come rap the word and reach the world for Christ. It's since been taken down, and some apologies have been issued. But this is the senior leadership of the largest white Christian seminary in the country that is running the School of Preaching for the next generation of evangelical ministers in the country, that this went under the radar until there was an outcry for. I may not need to say much other than that, but I'm going to say a little bit more. A couple of things that we've asked about that I think go right to the heart of it is two questions, two survey questions. One is a question, it's kind of a broad question that divides the country right in half, and it's this. Do you think that American way of life and culture has changed for the better or changed for the worse since the 1950s? The country is evenly divided on this question. The two political parties are mirror opposites of one another on this question, almost to the single digit. 2/3 of Republicans say things have changed for the worst since the 1950s. 2/3 of Democrats say things have changed for the better since the 1950s. Every group of white Christians, white mainline Protestants, those are supposedly the more progressive group, white evangelical Protestants say things have changed for the worst. But no group says things have changed for the worst more than white evangelical Protestants, 75% of whom say things have changed for the worst since the 1950s. The other question is somewhat similar, and just in terms of perception differences that are quite stark. And that is a question about whether the killing of unarmed men by police is an isolated, or do you see the killing of unarmed men by police as isolated incidents or are part of a broader pattern? Nearly 9 in 10 African Americans say these are absolutely part of a broader pattern. Only about 4 in 10 whites overall say that this is a broader pattern. A majority say these are isolated incidents. But here's the striking thing, since we're sitting in a church. If you take whites and you add religion, they move further from their black brothers and sisters on this question. White unaffiliated Americans look more like African Americans on this question than do white Christians on this question. So let me kind of wrap up with this. I mean, one of the biggest challenges here, I think, is our isolation, our racial and ethnic isolation from one another in the country. We did some survey work. We asked about people's closest friendships and who they had in their circle of closest friendships. So we asked about their race, their gender, their religion, and it turns out if we look at the average white person in America, their closest friendships, we asked them to name up to 7 people who were like really close to them. And the average social network, not Twitter, but like close friendship network of a white person in the country is 91% white. And 75% of whites have no person of color of any kind in their closest set of friendships. In our churches, this church is a wild anomaly from what we see. 85% of churches in this country are essentially monoracial churches. It has changed a little since the 1970s, but not that much as these measures are going. So I'll wrap up with this. At the end of the book, I compare another image, and it's a Coca-Cola commercial that came out in 2012. Some of you may have seen it. It aired during the Super Bowl. It was called It's Beautiful, right? And it was Coca-Cola, and they had people singing America the Beautiful in many different languages. It was a montage of all kinds of Americans, gay, straight, black, white, brown, you name it, in the thing. And there was a huge divide over how to react. There's a huge backlash on the one hand, said, we speak American here, those kinds of comments, on the one side, and other people embracing it. But I think if I think about that image, and in those images, there's a scene at the end where there are people sitting around a table, and it's a very multicultural, table, and there's a woman at the head of the table in that photo, and I compare it to that other one that I began the talk with, this black and white photo with this man at the head of the table, and I just can't resist this. By the way, we built this stuff into our furniture. Any of you have those antique dining room tables that only has one chair with arms on it, right? What's that about, right? That's the patriarch's chair. So this is what we have in this photo. And this contrasting image, right, of who are we? Who are we as a country? Who are we going to be? Who should we be? And this is the fight, I think, that we're having right now in the country. It's much less about, R or D. I mean, the R's and D's tend to stand in, I think, for this bigger question. In fact, in this election, we probably couldn't have had a more almost caricature of that question, right? With Donald Trump with this explicitly backward-looking "Make America Great Again" and this retro farmer hat on, and Hillary Clinton with this slick, very social media friendly H with the arrow pointing forward in it, right? I mean, there's two very contrasting images. But I think the task before us is to think about those two images, right? And particularly this second one, this multicultural image that says, and ask, is this, I think the questions are, is this the end of the world as we know it? And is it beautiful? Right? And the task, I think, is to help the country, and I hope, help white Christians in this country answer yes to both of those questions. I'll end it there.
They're so smart, aren't they? Another hand? So we've got about 15 minutes for Q&A, and I'm so grateful that you said yes and let me boss you around a bit about time. Awesome. Can I ask the first question to each of you, and then we're going to go out here. If you don't have a comment on it, let me know. We talk about where we are. I think I heard hope is in survival. I want to just ask you to give a sentence about where you're finding your hope. And it's okay to say, I'm not finding it, if that's how you're feeling it. But how are you finding your hope?
Okay.
Go Eboni.
Okay. I find it in many places. I mean, I was really inspired by Valerie's comments earlier about joy as a mechanism of resistance. But specifically, I find it really in tapping into the witness and power of my ancestors. I look back and think about and this goes to kind of the importance of the historical spectrum when we think about where we are today. Because when I think about all that those who came before me were up against and the ways in which they resisted that, I'm so deeply inspired, so deeply empowered to continue on and to stay in the struggle, and to know that change will come as long as we stay on the battlefield. So for me, my hope comes from my people.
Serene?
This keeps falling off my head, so I guess it's still working, yes. Two places. First, my daughter, who is 21 and is living in the Emirates learning Arabic, and is just as committed to revolutionary love as anyone I've ever seen in that generation. And every day I wake up at Union Theological Seminary and my students give me hope. They keep showing up and they keep wanting to learn and go back into the sacred scriptures, not just of Christianity, but of Judaism and Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism, and find new ways of moving forward with social justice. My students, hands down, are full of hope. Their existence is hope.
Awesome. Beautiful. Thank you, Serene.
Yes. So for me, I think the first place I go for hope, very much like the ancestors and the people I work with, I think it's my faith tradition, my wisdom tradition. So I'm a member of this church, but I'm also a practicing Buddhist. So in Buddhism, we really think about how everything is a product of cause and effect, right? That's what's known as karma. So really thinking about wise speech, wise action, wise livelihood as really means to create transformation. And then looking at the picture not from the narrow perspective, like when you mentioned that it was 78,000 votes. Yes, that's terrible because the outcome is something none of us wanted, but it's also then thinking about the glass half full. It's like, oh my God, it's just 78,000 votes. So we could do this work. So really shifting our perspective to see the brighter side simultaneously.
Thanks, Ilana. Appreciate that. Robbie?
I think I would just say that there's nothing in the upheavals of the last few months that changed the fundamental trends of what I was describing. The fundamental trends are, that the country has turned on its head in its support for the right to people to marry who they want, right, in less than a decade. That's remarkable. You just don't see that in public opinion trends. Like that kind of a flip is really, almost unprecedented. And so I think some of the upheavals, I think, are in fact rooted in the ends of things. Yeah.
Let's go here.
Hi, I'm Aisha Hauser. I don't know if any of you have heard about the disorder that's going on with the Unitarian Universalists. I am one. We have initiated, me and my colleague Cristina Rivera, who's in the audience, and Kenny Wiley, a UU white supremacy teach-in. And we were hoping for 150 congregations of 1,000. We have over 600 that have signed up to do it. And the pushback from white people has been extraordinarily painful. So I wanted to thank the two women especially who brought up the words white supremacy without anger and with, this is what this is. So one of the things I want to name, because Valerie, you said something about we don't want to turn into that with which we hate. And my sword is while I have compassion for the pain of white people who can't handle the words white supremacy, even though they call themselves liberal, I will not put white people's feelings over justice. And I wanted you to speak to them.
Thank you. Who's feeling like they want to take that on? Eboni, would you? How about the white person? Thank you, dear. How about that, Serene?
How about that? Yeah,
There's two white people.
Yeah,
okay, got it.
No, amen. And I think that, you're exactly right. It's when you just narrate reality, you come face to face with white supremacy. It's not an illusion. It's not something that you're making up just to be mean. It's just telling the story of this nation and how we became who we are and how we're continuing to behave. And it's Robbie's statistics. And I think that just naming it head on and addressing the moral issues at stake there. And also getting, I mean, when you really start, I think, so, and this is an interesting question for Robbie, so what is it that you're afraid of? Like, what really do you know, I mean, for some people, I think they are actually, white people are afraid that the rage of black and brown people is such that they're going to get killed when the power flips, that they're going to get treated as badly as they taught people. You know, I think that's like the primal fear in many white people, because they know that the history warrants that. And so to begin to unearth those kinds of fears and to say, now really, you know, let's talk about this in the context of what you actually know about your life and your relationships and where we're going.
That is so right, Serene. And Eboni wants to go, even though she's not white.
Oh, I was just going to say that, I mean, I think that there are a lot of things, including fear, that's under resistance, white resistance to engaging deeply with the matter of white supremacy. But, I mean, my quick retort is that Black lives, queer lives, Muslim lives matter more than white tears. And that's just what it is. So keep doing the work.
Okay, let's go here.
Hi, I am Jessie Nakamura. I'm a Master of Divinity student, and this semester I'm a visiting scholar at Union, so I am one of your students this semester, Dr. Jones, and I hope that you still feel that we give you hope after I ask you this question. My favorite class at Union was a class that I took with Dr. Hal Tausig on reframing the Gospel of Mark amid pain, loss, and trauma. Students at Union are currently experiencing the impending pain of the traumatic loss of our quad, our only green space, due to the construction of luxury high-rise condominiums. And so the question that I would like to ask is one that is taken from the 8th chapter of the Gospel according to Mark. What does it profit a person to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? And to that end, what is it that we hope to gain as an academic institution by entering into contracts that save a physical structure if the foundation of our institution, the principles on which we were built, are forsaken? How dare we continue to proclaim a platform of social justice, ecological justice, and racial reconciliation in light of our complicity in the ongoing gentrification of a historically black neighborhood in Harlem? I was so glad that you mentioned Winona LaDuke, because when she was at Union this week, she actually spoke to this. And she said that it is a tragedy that we are experiencing the loss of the heart of our campus. So for me, I would add to her words, and I would say that this display of corporate greed to me is racial violence, and that this artificial attempt at resuscitation, giving nod to Brian McLaren, is birthing a monstrosity. Thank you.
Sorry, did not know that was coming. Do you feel like you want to answer that?
Yeah,
Okay.
no, I'm happy to. And yes, of course, still great hope. This is not, that asking those kinds of questions are the questions and the determination that we need to have with all the things that we do. What I have had to come to grips with, I think all of us do in this work for justice, is that one of the models that gets us in trouble the quickest is when we're able to see struggles as pure. So all the time as the President of Union, and as we look to preserve the school and our crumbling buildings, and the fact that we don't have enough money, and we don't have enough money precisely because of our social justice positions to keep them upright and to inhabit them, that we were left with a choice that wasn't a choice we wanted to make. But we had to make a choice that, in my own mind, as someone in a leadership position, and I think this is hard, I keep thinking about what do I do? What is my responsibility for people, students, 50 years from now and 100 years from now, where if the choice is between doing this and closing the school, they won't have a place to have an education. And how do we keep this mission of educating social justice leaders continuing? And so that's a sort of messy mix of concerns that myself and the faculty and the board wrestle with as we come in this messy place called New York City and try to continue and stay alive. But thank you for your question.
Thank you, Jesse, for the question. Thank you, Serene.
Hi, I'm Terry Todd. I teach in the theological school at Drew University. And first of all, I want to thank you for an awesome panel. Fantastic kickoff. So and I also want to say I'm here with 4 Drew Theo students. We're here, yes? But my question is this: we've talked a lot about the United States and in this kickoff panel, and that makes sense because even though we're in the East Village, this is still the U.S., right? And so, but my question is, how can we begin to make connections between what we see happening in the United States and the rise of white nationalist, racist politics in places like Russia, in Hungary, and of course the National Front in France? How do we begin to make those connections between what you've talked about, very present realities in the US context? How do we begin to make connections with those who are fighting in the international context?
Can Anurag take that question? Yeah, sure. Yeah, that'd be great.
Thanks so much for that question. And I alluded to some of that by talking about the origins of the story of race altogether. So yes, I was talking about it from more of the American context, but it's that same story that operates in France, in Germany, in Russia, and Hungary that puts certain people as superior. Now, Gandhi once said that your beliefs become your thoughts become your actions become your character, and your character becomes your destiny. So if the underlying belief that those folks have is that they are better than immigrants, than Muslims, than Turks, than Algerians, then that actually becomes their destiny. That's the policies that they're being fed. So how do we tackle this? I think you mentioned this. Part of this ethic of revolutionary love is a revolution of consciousness, right? We really need to transform our consciousness to move beyond this idea of me versus you, us versus them, into just us. And knowing that all of us in this room, we're literally the same exact organism. There is no genetic or biological difference between us. Particularly if we're put in different racial categories, we might actually be more genetically similar and biologically similar. That's the wonder of human nature. We don't know why that's about. But this type of information is kept away from a lot of those white groups, right? So when we talk about the white evangelical Christians in this country, they're being fed a lot of toxic, negative, poisonous information about people of color, about immigrants, about Native Americans. And the same thing's happening in France among those working class communities, or even middle class and upper class communities. Same things are happening in Russia. So part of our goal for moving towards this revolution of consciousness and revolutionary love is to be the bridge builders. We have to build these bridges. We have to build coalitions in order to transform consciousness and then to move towards this ethic of revolutionary love.
Thank you, Anu. Friends, thank you. We are at, you want to go? Yeah, please.
Yes, I think we also need to be aware that the rise of fascistic governments is not just limited to white countries. And my brother here will know in India right now is a Hindustani leader, Muti, for whom the instantiation and protection of caste is the principal driving force behind it. So it's not just in northern historically white areas. It's a global phenomenon that we have to engage, and it's related to the movement of capital. And it's related to the survival of the market. And if we make it only about race, we miss the really important economic dimensions of why this is happening. So,
Eboni, and then I'm going to try to capture these questions in one swoop, okay? Because we're at time. So, Eboni?
I just want to add on to what has been said and to say that for as much as fascism, neo-fascism is not limited to white nations, we have to recognize the ways in which pigmentocracy or colorism is always attached to fascist projects. And so the lighter you are, right, across the world, and this is what a limited imagination will not allow us to see, that one's approximation toward whiteness in terms of skin color always sets one on the higher end of the binary hierarchy of racialization. So there's that too.
That's right on.